Afternoon. Thank you so much for being here. What you've come to here is a conversation that you can see on the screen. We're calling Visual Storytelling Styles and Standards. And we have kind of two audiences for this. One is our design center team. We're going to be talking about some technical details of things like typography and the grid that we use in our print product. We're going to be talking about the ethics around photo editing, talking about our color scheme. So all of those things are, if you work in the design center, that's kind of your daily world. Another audience here that's here is people, they're not designers, but of course, all of us journalists, we work with designers, we work with the design studio, and the choices that we make in how we write, how we communicate, how we plan, those all have consequences on the quality of the design that comes out. So even if you're not a designer, you're still in the right place. Knowing about our product, how it comes to into existence, and what you can do to make it better is well worth your time. So we're going to be hearing from 4 of the pros at the Design Center. As you can see, David, Amy, Elora, and GW are going to walk us through a variety of different topics. Like I said, they're different technical aspects of our design. And after each section, if you want to be asking questions, you can do that. So I'll keep my eyes on the chat and I'll acknowledge your question or the thought that you might want to have. And we'll call on you in between different sections. We plan to go an hour. If we go a couple minutes past, there will be, and you can't be here for the rest of it, I'll have a recording and I'll have all the goodies that go along with it that I'll communicate to everybody. So with that, I think GW, I'm handing it over to you.
Actually, I thought we were going directly to David, but
oh, great. Sorry about that.
We could just, I'll just say quickly, we're going to cover grids, typography, color, photo use, and ethics and diversity. And David's going to kick us off with the first section.
Thanks, GW. And thanks. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us. Looking forward to a good presentation here. I'm David Anesta, and I'm a manager of one of the Florida design teams. I've been here at Gannett since 2011, and I've also worked at the Sun Sentinel in South Florida, the New York Post, and the Prague Post. And I went to the University of Miami and got a degree in art and journalism. That's just a little bit about me. And in this section, I will be talking about the grid. So the grid may not sound like the most exciting topic to start out with, but it is one of the most important ones. It is a tool that we all use as publication designers. Just like the artist Piet Mondrian, whose painting was in that previous slide, he often used grids to organize geometric shapes in his paintings. And designers use grids to organize content, which is mostly made up of blocks of art and type. To use another analogy, if a newspaper were a building, the grid would be the frame that holds it all together, right? And defines where things can be placed. You know, like a window over here and a door over there. So messy pages like this one are, you know, just very hard to read and do a disservice for our readers. Which is why we use the grid to line everything up. It's really important to get things lined up. So I can imagine that if this was a real page, it would be very frustrating for our readers, even if they don't exactly realize why. On this page, nothing is lined up on the same grid. There are columns, but each story seems to have its own grid instead of having one common grid for the entire page. You know, imagine getting on a 6-lane highway, but all the lanes are like different widths. So, for example, if you've ever driven on the Belt Parkway, I live near New York, in Brooklyn, and then you know what I mean. I mean, you could still drive on it, but it can be a challenge to navigate. In the same way, a page in which the columns are all different widths, it can be hard for readers to navigate. Gutters are important. They are the space between each column. And when the gutters in each story don't match up, like on this page, the result is a lot of extra visual noise. So here's a page where the gutters do all line up, and the result is much less visual noise. The grid promotes order and symmetry, which in turn makes it easier for our readers to navigate. On this page, everything is strictly on a 4-column grid, which is the default grid that we use most often in the design center. So, like I said before, using the grid means that the sizes of all the elements on a page share a common symmetry, and this is important. All the column widths are the same, and so photo widths are proportional to each other. They're either 1, 2, 3, or 4 columns wide. And this simple math results in a page that is balanced and easier to read. It may not be obvious to our readers that the grid promotes balance and symmetry, but at a subconscious level, I think it makes designs easier to consume for readers. So when it comes to the daily grind of designing and producing our newspapers, the grid makes things so much easier. It allows designers to focus more on the storytelling. And the reason is once a designer learns how to use the grid, it eliminates much of the guesswork and sizing and spacing of things. For one, when a designer draws a column of type in our layout program, QDesigner, it is automatically the right size and it snaps to the grid. In addition, Designer is programmed to put the correct space between a lot of things. I mean, there's some exceptions, but for the most part, it does a good job. Another benefit of the grid is that all of our papers pretty much use the same grid. So if one paper has a centerpiece that another paper also wants to use, it is really easy to share the design. If we didn't have the common grid, the centerpiece would have to be resized to fit each paper that uses it. But right now, it just requires some minimal size changes when we share. And the grid allows us to have our shared news modules that only have to be designed one time, but they can run in a lot of papers. Sometimes they run in 100 or more different papers. And that saves time for designers to focus on higher value pages like covers. The Design Center has 4 different grids to choose from, and we're going to go through all of those right now. While having 4 different grids may not sound so simple, there's a reason for each grid. And the vast majority of pages that we design follow the 4-column grid, which is seen here. And when in doubt, my advice to designers is to stick with the 4-column grid because it really is the most universal and easy grid to use. However, we have a lot of ads that we publish that will fit on the 3-column grid, which doesn't really gel with a 4-column grid, like the example on the left. When a page has an ad like this, the editorial should also follow the 3-column grid. And we also have some special pages that usually are on a 3-column grid. For example, on the right, our opinion pages are mostly on a 3-column grid. One tip is to stick with the 4-column grid unless you have a good reason to use the 3-column grid. The 6-column grid is strictly for pages that have ads that are also on the 6-column grid, especially when those ads are not really modular and are kind of messy. And it really shouldn't be used anywhere else. So another tip, if you take a look at the page on the right, you can square off the editorial. If you can square off the editorial with the ads using the 6-column grid, then you can use a 3-column grid at the top of the page. And while this may seem counterintuitive, the 3 and the 6-column grid, 3-column and 6-column grid share the same gutters, so everything will line up really well. The 12-column grid is the Cadillac of newspaper grids. All of the grids divide equally into it, and it is primarily used for covers and special pages. Because it is a more complex grid, it's not really meant for inside pages because it's not really that efficient if you're trying to go fast. While the 4-column grid is good for covers, sometimes we need more flexibility to make elements on the page different widths. So that's what the 12-column grid is for. But it also does that while maintaining order and symmetry, making sure that the gutters all line up. So if you take a look at the page on the right, the photo and the info box in the centerpiece benefit from having more widths to choose from, but they still line up. So this is my last slide. It is about the baseline grid. And while it's only one slide, I don't want to diminish its importance. Almost all of the little type on a page, including body copy, cut lines, bylines, line up on the baseline grid. And this is important because when things line up, it makes the page less busy. It is also a tool to measure the space between things vertically, and so we can have consistency in all our products. For example, stories should sit 2 grid lines above advertisements, and they should sit 2 grid lines below the 1A flag. And there's a lot of little rules like that. So I would suggest checking out our Unify Style Guide for all of the spacing rules. And I think that where to find that will be shared later. Like the column grid, most elements snap to the baseline grid so that makes it easy in our programs for things to line up. So I think that's the end. And I think next is Amy Stanfield, who will be talking about headlines. And thanks very much for listening to me about the grid.
Yeah, well done. And before Amy gets going, David, there was a question Tracy
Sure.
had, and what Tracy asked, you were starting to get into criteria about how you make choices about different grid choices. He's asking, the 12 column being the sort of the one that can do the most, but also like it's a little bit of a high wire act. How do you what's the criteria that you have to have met to use the 12 column grid, or is that just like more of a thing you can just feel it and know it when it's time?
Well, I'm sure there's a lot of different criteria. For me, I usually start with the 4-column grid on covers, like if I'm working on a 1A. And as I'm designing the page, I might find that there's a piece of content like a pull quote or an info box that is kind of small and doesn't really fit into the 4-column grid very well. Or maybe there's a photo that would work really well at like 2.5 columns wide. Of course, you can't really do 2.5 columns wide. So that's when I will switch to the 12-column grid to see if that helps me fit those elements together.
Nice. Okay, good. I'm teaching my son about least common denominator and in math right now, and I might just have him talk to you, David, because it sounds like you got that figured out. Perfect. Okay, Amy, you're next.
Thanks, everyone. My name is Amy Stanfield. I am a design center manager for New England and Atlantic North Papers. I started with Legacy Gannett or Gatehouse actually in 2012 as a page designer. Prior to joining Gatehouse, I was a reporter for a few different weekly newspapers, and I have a bachelor's degree in English communications. I will be talking about headlines from our styles and standards to how readers view headlines. Headlines are the first part of the story the reader gets. This is their first sense of what they are about to read. Headlines need to accurately reflect the content, and this includes how we play those headlines on the page. Think of a headlines as a roadmap for readers to guide them around the page. Use the provided headlines as a starting point to understand the context of the story, along with noting how those stories are prioritized on the budget. Remember that you are sending a visual message to the reader based on how large or small we choose to run the headlines on the page. The larger we play up a headline, the more emphasis is put on the importance of the story. Ensure that your headlines match the tone of the story. We have 2 main headline styles, bold and medium. Most stories will use bold headlines, while medium headlines will be reserved for lighter feature pieces. Medium headlines are likely to be used once per page. When it comes to headline hierarchy, we must find a balance between guiding the reader and making sure that no story is lost on the page. If some headlines are way bigger than others on the page, we may devalue other important stories on the page or cause them to be completely lost in the background. These point size guidelines will help you create balance on your page between your headlines while still distinguishing them enough from each other. The largest headlines will run at the top of the page and should decrease in size as you move down the page. In addition to proper point size, the number of lines a headline should be is based on how many columns of text that headline is running over. Like our point size guidelines, this is essential to creating a balance and should encourage you to edit headlines so they fit the space on your page. Remember that you want to guide the reader from the top of the page to the bottom of the page. Worth noting here that 2-line headlines are frequently overused when the news doesn't call for it. Headlines of this size should be reserved for major breaking news, such as bombings in Paris or when a governor is resigning in the midst of a scandal. Beyond that level of news, we should work to edit headlines down. A good tip to break down a long headline is to incorporate a deck, which I will talk more about shortly. Speaking of editing, this is part of our design process, and it is expected that designers and page editors spend time editing headlines so they fit the right point sizes and column widths, as well as ensure that they accurately reflect the content of the stories. And of course, a reminder to use spell check. Errors can happen, but we need to remember to use the tools we have to avoid those embarrassing display type errors making it to print. We have a few other types of headlines to work with if the content calls for something different: screamer, standalone, and italic headlines. Screamer headlines should be reserved for big news only on cover pages, such as 1A or a sports cover. It is not to be used on inside pages. In these examples, I have included one positive use for screamer headline, the Bengals' historic road to Super Bowl, to show that there are some rare circumstances where the screamer isn't necessarily associated with bad news. Standalone headlines are medium semi-bold headlines that run over a single image. These can run on 1A or inside pages. In Q Designer, there are shapes available for standalones. These shapes have the headline in all caps and the captions already formatted as intro text, so you don't have to make that change manually. Remember, standalone headlines should run between 24 and 42 points, depending on where they are positioned on the page. Be sure to balance the size of the headline with the sizing of the image as well. Italics should never be used at hard news stories. Rather, it should be reserved for feature pieces or headlines that incorporate a quote or emotion. It's best reserved for stories with impact on covers and not on inside pages. Reach out to a manager if you're unsure if it is appropriate to use. If you do use italics, remember to use the display italic fonts rather than blowing up italic text fonts. A good headline deck combination adds meaning and increases readership by giving additional context. With longer stories, readers are more likely to plunge into a sea of text if they know in advance what it's about. Decks are also a handy tool when you're trying to properly size a headline. Longer words can often be put into a deck so you can bump up the point size on the headline. Your decks are great to use when you have a headline with limited words. The deck can give the reader much more context and provide an additional entry point for the story. Newsrooms are welcome to provide decks with stories, but designers and page editors can also add them as needed. Decks have point size considerations just like headlines. Any bold headline under 30 points or a medium headline under 36 points should not have a deck with it. Your deck should never be more than half the point size of the headline and no less than 15 points. Like headlines, decks have limits on how many lines they should be. Decks should not be more than 5 lines in depth when positioned in the first leg of type. However, it's worth noting that this can vary if it's run across more than one column of text. Keep in mind, your headline deck combination shouldn't significantly overtake the amount of space the body copy is given on the page. And with that, are there any questions out there?
I haven't seen any, Amy, in the chat. Anybody want to ask Amy about headlines? That's certainly, I think that's one of the integration points between reporters and editors in the design center, because, well, Amy just explained that. So anything anybody wants to ask about that? Okay, well, we can come back if something occurs to you. Oh, actually, Rama's got a question. Rama, go ahead and speak up if you'd like to share your question.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So thank you for all this insightful information. I just wanted to know if I have like a cover with like 4 or 5 stories on it, what would be the best way in terms of size to arrange like the heads on the story? Like you have a centerpiece and then an off lead and lead and then the down page.
My best advice is to always start by placing all of your shapes on the page, because those shapes come with the point size considerations on them. So if you have a centerpiece and you want that centerpiece head to be 54 points, you put that 54 point shape there and then edit your headline to fit that space. Don't make the point size bigger or smaller. Actually edit the headline to that space. That's what I like to do when I design. I put all my shapes on. I know where all my headlines are going to go. I use those those points considerations on the shapes themselves to guide me and help me edit where I need to edit.
Yes, okay. And for the lead, how large do you usually have it? Because I saw one of the slides saying like 60 points, which is kind of bigger than.
Yeah, a lead. If you have a strip lead across the top, that's 54 to 72 points should be your top. But if you don't have a strip lead, you have like a lead centerpiece, that's going to run 54 to 60 points. We can provide this information separately later too, because I know we kind of went through kind of quickly here.
Yes, okay, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for that question, Rama. I think others will have been wondering just as you did, so appreciate it, and we can follow up after. So with that, I think. Oh, go ahead.
I often find that I am working with a page editor and they need me to downsize more, sometimes up to 6 points, and the back and forth explaining why you can't do that. Or if they write under and you're kind of at, you're at the top of the page, you wrote 42, there's maybe like 4 letters short to fill out the space. You have no room to bump up the headline size. That's where I find a lot of my difficulty with headline hierarchy. I sometimes find with page editors on inside stories, they don't want decks because they don't have time to write them. And so I find myself just doing 24.6 for all inside pages because that's what's best for them. So how do you find that balance between doing what's best for the design of the page or what's best for the workflow for the page editor?
I can't speak to a page editor workflow necessarily, working on the DP teams, but I think communication is the biggest part. Getting into those stories as soon as possible and making those edits. I think cover pages is where you want to put a lot of your focus too. That's my personal opinion, is to tackle the cover and make sure that design looks best as it can possibly be, and get those point sizes, make sure the hierarchy is there, and prioritize the inside pages as best you can. I think that's my best piece of advice there.
Nice, awesome. Thanks, Aaron, for speaking up with that question, and Rama from before. All right, I jumped the gun before. I tried to introduce GW at the beginning, and it wasn't at the right time. So now I'm going to throw it over to him, and you're going to see his first screamer headline in one slide from now. So GW, all yours.
Thanks, Mackenzie. Like you said, I'm GW Babb. I'm the creative lead for the Design Center. I joined Gatehouse when we opened the Center for News and Design in Austin in 2014. So I've been with Gatehouse Gannett since then. Before that, I was with the Austin American-Statesman as a director of graphics and design for nearly 25 years. And I had earlier stints at the Orange County Register and the Dallas Morning News. And I have a Bachelor of Journalism degree from the University of Texas at Austin. And in this section, I'm going to talk about the use of color. So our Unified Style Guide has a very specific description of how color should be used in our design, based in part on a colored palette developed specifically for it. So to start, I want to share with what the guide says about the Design Center's philosophy of our color use. The Design Center's design system uses a minimalist approach to color. The philosophy always The philosophy allows color photography and illustration to drive design. Beyond photos, illustration, and any color pre-built into furniture or shapes, color should only be used to create contrast and separation between two or more elements when shades of black are not sufficient, or as an entry point to help the reader navigate through the page. Reproduction remains a top priority when using color, so color choices are limited to swatches in our approved color palette, which are engineered for optimal printing on difficult presses. More on that in a couple of minutes. Color type and type placed on a color background must meet minimum sizing requirements to ensure readability. Color is not permitted in headlines unless it's needed for contrast and should never be used on headlines written in a traditional news style. And the last key point I want to make and emphasize here is color is not something used for decorating a page, but instead a tool for improving the structure of a page or centerpiece design. So our print process is based on 4-color printing. All color elements of our printed pages are generated by 4 separate plates on a press, 1 each for the cyan, magenta, yellow, and black inks. The lower part of the image on the screen shows you the amount of ink that would be on each of those plates. As the page runs through the press, the 4 colors are laid on top of each other to create the 4-color image you see above. If you're going to add color to a page in any way, you need to make sure you have the right color palette available. For most, if not all papers in Q, the DC Unified Colors palette is not the default when you open a page in Designer. So before you try to select a color from the swatches window, double check that this is your color model. As part of the updates to Unified Style, as the former Design Studio and C&D combined, a new color palette was created. The palette was engineered to include a wide range of colors that should print well. All colors in this palette use a maximum of 3 out of 4 plates. Many use only 2. This should help reduce poor registration costs when the colors layered on top of each other during the printing process. Use of color in headlines, drop caps, display text such as pull quotes and labels should be limited and discussed in advance with the manager or TL. Generally, it's best to stick with black or gray or brand blue, especially on straight news pages. It bears repeating that color is not something used simply to decorate a page. In the first example here with drawing a crowd, the gray headline text is one element of a design that helps it stand apart from regular daily design, but it's not decorative color that would distract from the photos on the page. If you do use color in display text, it should serve a purpose beyond dressing up a design. On the Growing Strong page, the red on strong is intentional and ties that word to the red numbers in the bottom of the package, which shows strong growth in those areas. Excuse me. I once had an editor who said that running a newspaper press is like printing 60,000 copies an hour on toilet paper. The point being, we don't always get the best printing on newsprint, and that needs to be taken into consideration if you're going to make text a color or reverse text out of a color blocker photo. Remember, what you see is not always what you get. These 2 samples look great on a monitor. Color registration refers to how well each of the color plates line up on a page as it goes through the press, and for good registration, they must line up precisely. If color registration isn't nearly perfect, the result can look like something that requires 3D glasses, as you see in these examples. Use of color type or type on a color background or photo should be limited and must meet minimum sizing requirements to ensure legibility. Keep in mind the registration issues discussed earlier to determine whether the pros outweigh the potential cons. If you do decide to go one of these routes, for body text on top of color or reversed out of color, use the intro text style and size. For smaller sans text, such as byline credits, photo credits, quote IDs, etc., those should be increased at least 1 point. One of the more difficult things about working with text on photos is finding an area of the photo with a consistent background. The background should be an even light color for black text or an even dark color for reverse text, as you can see on the burger page. But if the background has both light and dark areas, it's unlikely that either the black or white text will read well. If you're going to use color blocks on a page, they should serve a purpose, such as helping to organize the elements on the page, or maybe to draw attention to a small but important bit of information, such as a fact box. But be thoughtful and aware of the frequency of use. It should be more rare than common. And when choosing colors, contrast is key. If the text is to remain black, go with the lightest shade of that color family. If you're going to reverse text, go with the darkest shades. And always be wary of trying to sample colors out of a photo for backgrounds, especially dark ones, which will most likely include all 4 color plates. The saturation of inks on paper can be greater than presses can handle effectively, and the color basically turns to mush. And if there is reverse text, the inks bleed so that the text can fill in, making it illegible. For those reasons, it's always best to use a DC unified color option.
All right, GW. There's a lot to color, and it's definitely a artistic and manufacturing mashup there. So we appreciate that. There's some discussion going on. There's an inside joke about letting and kerning, but there's also some questions. So let me just tap a few people. Emily, you were in there, kind of in a discussion. Can you summarize that up? What you want to share or ask? And if you're trying to speak, we need to have your mic on. All right. She's passing for the moment. Mike Babin, you had something you wanted to suggest. What's on your mind?
Sure. I think there was a little bit of a discussion about where we have the ability to do tracking, which is adjusting, the overall space between letters in entire sections of text. In our unified style, we do allow for that tracking to take place in body text. The default for body text is that it's set to 0, but you can track as tight as -15, which means you can squeeze a few more letters together on a line if you're trying to get a story to fit without it being overset. But we discourage tracking taking place in headlines because it can bastardize the way that the typography looks to the reader, and it's already set in kind of a perfected amount of space between letters. So we discourage actually tracking in headlines. But if something's a character over and it's just impossible to rewrite a headline to fit, if you need to bump down a headline a point or 2 to fit, that's okay. I think one of the discussions earlier was about maybe needing to take a headline down like 6 or 12 points in order for something to fit. There's definitely kind of a happy medium between shrinking a headline a point or 2 to fit versus having it go down in such a degree that all of a sudden, maybe your typography hierarchy on a page is out of whack. So we allow for a little bit of that wiggle room as far as tracking in body text, but we prefer not to do it in display.
Excellent, Mike. Thanks. And Aaron Baker-Kraft, you were asking about the -15. Did Mike's answer get to every part of your question, or was there something else you wanted to ask about?
No, I think there was just some confusion, and but I think everybody understands that there's no tracking in headlines, but we can track in the body copy. So I think everybody's clear on that now.
Excellent. Yep. Okay, anybody else want to speak up with a question or a thought before we move on to photos? Okay, you'll have another chance here at the end, but thanks for all that. Okay, Elora Karim, your turn.
Hello, everyone. I'm Elora Karim. I started at Gatehouse about 5 years ago, designing New England papers. Briefly designed for non-dailies on the Gannett side, and now I am a page designer for Team Florida and a member of the DC's Diversity, Ethics, and Inclusion team. And I will be taking us through photographs. So pictures are a powerful medium, and it can be a really effective tool when pursuing good design. A single picture, like this one by Dorothea Lange, in some cases can be so powerful that it can change public opinion and have a real impact on the world. This photo of a migrant mother came to symbolize the entirety of the Great Depression. The best photojournalistic photographs transport the readers to a specific time and place to relive the events that unfolded in front of the photographer. In cases where you have a package with really stunning art, think of design as needing to complement the photos to make them shine on the page, so the viewer can slide easily into the perspective of the photographer. There's a reason a picture is worth 1,000 words is a popular adage. Photographs are an incredibly strong element that can immediately and succinctly describe a situation. It can convey information that can otherwise be difficult to explain concisely and quickly with words. Ways an effective photograph does that is through emotion and energy, size and scale, and color and light. When designing a page with multiple images, hierarchy is key. You could say it's hierarchy. That means that you should vary the dimensions of your photos. Having a dominant primary photo tells readers what is most important on the page and prevents photos from competing with each other in the eyes of the reader. This rule of hierarchy holds true for most pages. However, sometimes running images the same size is okay. The example we often run into is comparing things of equal value. During election season, we always try to make mugs of candidates running for the same office as equivalent as possible. Another use of running images the same size is when multiple images are grouped together as one visual element on the page. Sometimes, instead of a package, you'll have a single standalone photo to tell your story. There are 3 different shapes in the Q shape library for that. One is the centerpiece standalone, and the other 2 are for when the standalone is a secondary image on the page, one of which is designed for an extra long cut line. When handling photos, we must not misrepresent the information or meaning of a photo by distorting or manipulating it in any way. Manipulating a photo by flopping, rotating, skewing, squishing, stretching, or photoshopping it is the equivalent to changing the words in a direct quote. Our job as visual storytellers is to tell stories truthfully, and sometimes altering a photo minimizes its original impact too. The exception to this is when you are using stock photos as part of a photo illustration. We'll have more on that in a little bit. We shouldn't crop photos in a way that omits information that changes the meaning of the photo. Take this image of a person doing a pull-up all on his own. But look, he has help from a friend. As designers, it's our job to tell stories in a truthful and transparent way. So cropping it in a way, like removing the friend, obscures the truth, and that is an absolute no. News photos are meant to tell a story by providing information to readers. Covering up that information can be a disservice to readers then. On the slide, devastation in the photo is obscured by the word itself and the decks and the box behind them. However, there are some exceptions. First, moments of celebration, like a Super Bowl win, will often have photos with space for a headline on the photo. Second, stories of remembrance, like the passing of a president or other VIP, will often have photos with space for a headline. And third, enterprise stories in which the photo's primary purpose is not to provide information, but to illustrate a concept or set a tone. For example, a story about rising gas prices might have a photo of a gas pump in which there is space for a headline in the photo. Transforming a photo into a photo illustration using software like Photoshop is one way to tell a reader that a story is complex or important. They can visually explain a concept like the page on the left, or set the mood like the page on the right. When a great centerpiece story doesn't have great visuals, a photo illustration can be a great option. As I said, illustrations are great for presenting complex concepts in visual terms, and so some stories will call for an original illustration, like the following examples. So in a similar way that a photojournalist will tell a story using a camera, an illustrator uses a program like Photoshop or Illustrator to tell the story. Illustrations can come in all shapes and sizes. They can use color and movement to show the intensity of a story. They can also help to make a story stand out, like the Dynasty CP on the sports cover, celebrate our culture and achievements, and tie together a series of stories with a shared visual theme, like the Hallowed Sound page that takes all of these important figures and ties them together visually, or present a point of view and set the tone of a story for a reader. The gun laws page makes you feel the column even before you read it. But no matter what, all illustrations must have proper credit that identifies it as an illustration, and details for how to do that are in the Unify Style Guide. There are also further rules about when and how to ethically use photo illustrations, but GW will talk about that in a little bit. So if there are any questions on photographs, now is the chance. Otherwise, you can ask again at the end.
Yeah. Actually, I have one, Elora. So you were talking about how headlines and pictures work together. And so let's say you're in a newsroom, or you're a photographer in a newsroom, and let's use your Super Bowl example, where we might want to make a picture intentionally with space, empty space or negative space or whatever would accommodate a headline that would go with it. What's the kind of the process for photographers in the design center working together to see that possibility ahead of time and get the right art that's going to work for it?
I would say, like, for example, in that instant, if I see a photo package come in, first of all, I'll check to see if the editors left any notes being like, I would really prefer to have this photo on the cover. And if so, if they don't have any specific ideas ahead of that, I'll see if there is already, just looking at the photo, a good space for a headline, whether it's in front of a box or something. Otherwise, if the editor does have a note or messages me being like, hey, this is the photo that we want to present in a compelling way, obviously I'll check with the editor and the photographer, or ask the editor to check with the photographer to be like, is it okay if I manipulate this as a photo illustration, since we're normally not supposed to touch news photos, and then stretch it out in Photoshop. That one's one of the easier things for me to do, at least in Photoshop. But it really is just a matter of communicating directly on the budget of the page, especially in that case when sports photos so often comes in pretty late for a page and for design. So.
Got it. Okay. And then there's some questions about cropping. There's a photographer, Aaron, Aaron, would you like to speak up with your question?
Sure, I can do that. Yeah. Hi. I was curious about if there are kind of guidelines for when designers make decisions to crop images. There are some times where I see it and it totally makes sense, and sometimes I see it, I guess I'm a little surprised because my compositional choice in my photo has now been taken away by a crop that kind of limits the visual idea that I had originally. And I know that sometimes can be more of a conversation, but just I'm curious what those decisions look like.
I'll say I definitely have been one of those designers that have accidentally cropped a photo and then realized too late that was definitely a composition idea that I had missed coming from the photographer. So I definitely will say, if you do have a photo that's very much supposed to stand on its own as is, definitely ask your editor to put a note in the budget to say, if you're going to use this photo, or please try to keep it as is if you can. Especially if it's one that they're definitely going to be using just as a strong photo. But in general, when I look at photos, I want to keep it as intact as possible to respect the photographer's point of view. And we'll try to keep from cropping things that start obscuring the subject matter. It's a lot easier, obviously, in photos that have people in them. It gets a little bit more esoteric when you're looking at like landscapes and things like that, but just having a basic idea of, I guess, looking at photo composition and like rules of thirds, basic things like that, it really much is just I try to keep the integrity of the photo as intact as possible and keep the subject in focus. But really, the best advice I have is if there's something in particular that may not be immediately obvious, especially when things are on a deadline rush, sometimes things might just go over our head. So if there's something in particular, definitely keep communication open for that.
Sounds good. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yep, and thank you for the question, Aaron. A couple follow-ups on, well, John's got a question. You kind of got at it a little, Elora, but John's asking whether the CND has photo editors who can help with cropping decisions. And so you kind of talked about the back and forth, but what kind of specific photo expertise is in-house at the CND?
I wouldn't say, I don't know for certain that we have photo specific experts, but considering a lot of us do come from design backgrounds that try to have an idea of what visually, how we're supposed to present stories. Oftentimes, if I'm looking at a picture and I'm not sure what to do with it, or if there was a specific idea that I might be missing, I'll just talk to one of my team leads or other people on my team or my managers to see what their take on it is. Or I will, again, keep up communication with the editors at the site. And so it's really just getting more opinions and just using the experience that we've had working with similar stories or similar designs. Okay, excellent. And then Dominic's got a fascinating question that kind of echoes back a little bit to GW's talk on how color is rendered on a 4-color separation in print versus the tightly controlled rendering that you can expect digitally. Dominic, share your question with us if you would, please. We can't hear you if you're speaking right now. Okay, well,
yeah, hi, sorry.
Yeah. Yep.
Had to put my headset on. Yeah, I was just wondering if when we're out there as a photographer and we're doing our photos, if there are certain things that could impact a way that the photo is going to be presented on newsprint versus the way it's going to come out on digital. Sometimes, I don't know, newsprint can bleed, it can become darker, or some things can get a little washed out. And I was just wondering if there's things that we should be keep in mind.
So David actually answered this in the chat while you were asking the question. There's a department called the Regional Toning Center, the RTC, and they process all of the photos that run in print. So they're basically in charge of optimizing whatever photos will end up getting printed to look as good as they should be. So I don't think that's really a worry you necessarily need to have. They'll generally be taking care of that.
Great. Thank you, Elora. That's awesome, and thanks for all the great questions. And if you want to come back and ask any other questions about photos at the end, we can do that. We're going to go back to Amy, who you met a little bit earlier, and learn more about display type.
Thanks, Mackenzie. Next up, I'm going to talk about a few different kinds of display type you can use on your pages. Along with headlines and decks, we have other kinds of display type tools we can use on our pages. Earlier, I noted how headlines can serve as a map for readers, so I like to think of things like labels, intro text, quotes, and breakout boxes as points of interest along the way. These items give the reader additional points of entry or interest to the stories on the page. Like the examples here, 1 or 2 of these can provide more information and encourage reader engagement with your stories. It can be as simple as the addition of a pull quote or more complex with a detailed info box. Like decks, labels can also help you provide the reader with more information about a story. It's a useful tool to make headline editing and sizing easier. It's worth noting, though, that you don't want to use too many labels. If one is needed, there should only be one per page on a single story, or possibly a package of stories under the same topic. Most of the time, you will use the standard gray 12-point label. We do have a blue label available. However, that is only for enterprise centerpieces and major stories, or as part of an ongoing series. The most rarely used enterprise project labels can be created for newsrooms running a series that is running across multiple platforms. These should be created following conversations with design managers. Project labels should not be created by designers without consultation with a manager. The use of intro text comes with some specific guidelines as noted here, but there are other things that should be taken into consideration before deciding to use intro text. Intro text shouldn't be used to dress up stories that wouldn't need it. Think about the context of a story. Intro text is most often used with centerpieces, however, not all centerpieces will work with intro text. Often you'll want to use intro text with feature pieces and not so much with hard news type centerpieces. To give an example, think if you have a centerpiece about a high-profile murder trial. The context of this story would make the use of intro text inappropriate by dressing it up too much. But if, say, the centerpiece is a profile of a victim with family and friends remembering the individual, intro text might be a better fit in that case. When you do have a centerpiece that doesn't work well with intro text, you can try using a pull quote or a breakout info box instead. But of course, these all work well with any type of story and are not specifically limited to being used with centerpieces like intro text is. In the example of the murder trial story, you can add an info box with key facts on the case, important dates, or even a refer to continuing online coverage between print editions. Newsrooms are more than welcome to provide breakout and info boxes for designers to utilize on the page with a story package. If time permits, designers can also look for items to pull out of the story text to use as a breakout themselves. Be sure to verify the accuracy of the information you use. Pull quotes are also excellent display type tools that can add more impact to your designs. Look for strong, emotional, and/or detailed quotes or passages that engage readers. The voices of others can resonate with and create connections with readers. In these examples, designers utilized one or two display type tools to create points of interest and encourage reader engagement with these stories. Remember not to overdo it with labels, intro text, quotes, and breakouts. Keep it simple and only use one or two in a package. Your goal is to engage the reader, not to overstimulate them with too many doodads all over the page. Consider the idea that you don't need to put too much makeup on your pages. Sometimes all you need is a little mascara. Often the simplest designs can stand out the most. Do I have any questions out there?
This time we didn't have any questions, but again, folks can take a crack at it at the end if anything occurs to them.
Okay.
All right. GW, back to you.
Okay, so as designers, we make choices every day that affect how well we reflect our commitment to ethics and diversity as individuals and as an organization. So how are ethics and diversity part of design? Where you position a story on a page and the amount of real estate you give it should reflect its relative importance when considered with other content on the page. This is how we as designers signal to readers how big news is from day to day. You don't want to overplay or underplay stories based on their news value. That's why it's so important to think about your pages, how your pages are designed from day to day rather as a one-off. And also why you want to be careful of increasing or decreasing the size of a suggested headline to fill the desired space rather than rewriting it so that it fits at an appropriate size. In these pages, the headlines and story footprint reflect the relative importance of the day's news. The first page is from the Austin American-Statesman. Central Texans recently reacted to an upcoming freeze with something akin to PTSD from last winter's storm, which resulted in days-long losses of power and water. So while it's big, it was warranted. The second page is from the Cincinnati Enquirer. The Bengals reached the first Super Bowl in nearly 35 years, and this page reflected how exciting and important that was for the city. And the last page is from the Reporter-Times in Martinsville, Indiana. It's a very clean but more standard front page where the headline weights, sizes, and placement give the reader a path from the most important to least important stories on the page. When it comes to ethics and balance in design, we have a couple of areas to keep in mind. The first is hate speech in our images. Just as we strive to keep hate speech out of stories, we should do the same with photos and images such as editorial cartoons. Photos that include imagery of hate, such as a flag with swastika at a rally, should be cropped to remove the negative portions and focus on faces, for instance, or the photo shouldn't run. The second is the use of police-provided mugshots. This is an important reminder. As part of an update to Gannett's coverage of public safety issues, it was determined that police mugshot photos should be used rarely, if ever. Police mugs can be dehumanizing and are often provided early in the legal process before people have been convicted or even officially charged in a crime. So the updated policy states that we should stop using police mugs in all but the rarest of instances. They should be used only when, after a discussion involving diverse journalists, consensus develops that there is value in publishing one. A couple of examples could be a state legislator mugshot after a DUI arrest, or a murder suspect who's still being sought in a manhunt. Always look for alternatives, even when consensus develops that a mugshot would be justifiable. Can we get a family photo? Or if the person is someone of note, is there a file photo that could be used instead of the police mug? And in the rare instances that we do use a police mug, never publish it as main art, whether it's with story in print or in the top spot on a website. When we start to talk about image manipulation, we need to determine when it is acceptable. News events should be presented as they happened. Therefore, photos from breaking news events should not be manipulated in any way, including fades, extensions, transparencies, and, except on very rare occasions, placing text on the photo. Rare exceptions might include more celebratory events, such as the presidential inauguration or sports championships, which might be presented as poster pages. On America's Day, the sky was extended to create a background for placement of the paper's logo and the display type elements. On the other two pages, the photos faded into a dark background area to create a place for large dramatic headlines. Since these are all commemorative image pages, the manipulation is acceptable, but this type of image manipulation should be labeled as a photo illustration. So when is manipulation acceptable? Photos with news features and in-depth or analysis pieces, or pieces using file photos or photos shot with specific intention of creating a special effect can be manipulated. Stock images also can be manipulated, but they all must be labeled as illustrations. Source photos, whether from a newsroom's photographer or a stock source such as Getty Images, should be credited as well. Specifics on illustration credits can be found in the Unified Style Guide. When considering diversity in imagery, avoid stereotypes at all costs. Forget those images you may have in your head, the ones you may have seen from a type of event in years gone by. Look for photos that represent people as they live today, whether it be interacting with their families of birth or of choice, celebrating with friends, or just doing their daily jobs. Remember that presenting an accurate reflection of the story and community is key. If designers have questions on any of these ethics and diversity topics, you can discuss them with your manager or TL. And don't forget that the Design Center has a diversity, ethics, and inclusion team with its own channel and teams where Design Center staffers can post similar questions.
All right, before we head back to Elora to wrap up, is there anything from an ethics standpoint that as relates to these visuals that anybody wants to ask or raise? Okay, and I'll put a link in the chat here when we wrap up. We did a whole session specifically on ethics as relates to design a couple of months ago. So that's got tons of great resources in it. Okay, Elora.
All right, just to sort of wrap up everything that we talked about, here's a list of resources that designers can use to help them make designs that follow the guidelines we just talked about, just in case you sometimes see a package and you think there's no way that I'll be able to design it following the rules exactly and you have to break them. These are a lot of different places that I often go to get help or inspiration. And we do have a handout that we'll be able to pass out to designers for a better explanation on what every single one of these locations or softwares or websites are. And if you don't know what any of these are or don't have access to it, whether it's an account or a software that you can't get to, go ahead and ask your manager for help and they'll be able to do that.
All right, and all of these, so what you see on the screen right here, these are hyperlinks in the document that you're going to get. So watch this channel I guess the chat that's tied to this meeting. I'm going to later on put a recording of this meeting along with links to the different things we talked about, like this tip sheet, like the whole session we did on ethics a couple of months ago. Anything else that came up over the course of today will all be bundled into one place, which you're welcome to share as widely inside or outside the company as you want. And with that, let me just see, we've talked about a lot of stuff. We talked about the grid. If you can think back to an hour ago, that David helped us with. We talked about pictures that Elora helped us with. We talked about headlines that Amy helped us with. GW walked us through color. And ethics as well. Is there anything on those topics or anything else that folks would like to ask while we're all together? Okay, barring that, oh, there is a hand up somewhere, and there's so many people on here. I have no idea who raised their hand, so just speak up if you want.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. My name is Frank Piscani. I cover high school sports for the Pocono Record in Pennsylvania. I was just wondering, GW, on the slide where you talked about cropping hate speech out of images, like how that differs from the guidance to not change, the meaning of a photo when cropping it. I think what comes to mind is just because you mentioned Nazi flags as an example. I think back to shooting at the Capitol insurrection, just with a lot of photos of Confederate flags. Maybe that's just not to the same level of an image, but it, like, to me, just as a reporter, that seems like part of the story. Or is that still something that should be cropped out?
Well, we have had a lot of conversations in the DEI team, and Tracy Collins might want to jump in at any point here, but we are trying very hard not to use hate speech, whether it's visual or words, that hurt people. That's our whole point. So excuse me. Yeah, you're taking away something that exists there, but you're doing it for a reason, as opposed to you're cropping something crucial out of a photo in order to make it fit on a page. I don't think that it's a thing that you take lightly, but it is, goal of our company nowadays to strive to be more inclusive and not, I guess, isolate people in a way. Yeah.
If I can jump in real quick, I like to think of that as essentially when you're reporting, you obviously don't want to accidentally become a loudspeaker for the exact hate that you're trying to report on. And so it is a very careful balance of making sure that in reporting and showing the image of a hate symbol, you are not accidentally somehow amplifying it. And so the decision doesn't come lightly, but it definitely is thought of. What is the point of the photo isn't necessarily the hate on the symbol or the sign that's in a photo, but the protesters around it. And so you can convey that in the actual body of the article, for example, or in another way, as opposed to just repeating the symbol itself.
And also we know that images have a lot of power. They're the first things that readers see when they look at a page. So you're kind of hitting them over the head with something in a way that they're not, if you can describe the same situation in the story, if that makes sense.
Yeah, go ahead, Frank. Did you want to follow up there?
Oh, no, I just very much makes sense. So thank you both for the thoughtful answer.
And I'm glad you asked that, Frank. I was wondering the same thing. I'm not going to suggest this about the swastika, but these are subjective decisions, and not everybody's going to come to the same conclusion. So I think kind of it goes back to something that Elora said a lot of times, right, where there's an open line of communication to work through every sort of exceptional situation, and we'll get to a better answer than just going, by what some written guide that might not have been built for this situation says. All right, any other questions before we wrap up, or statements that anyone wants to say? Okay, it's been an enlightening hour. I'll just speak for myself. I'm not a design professional, but I am a journalist, and I learned a lot here about how all the different visual pieces go together and how the decisions get made, how wherever you are in the content process is part of the design process. So Frank, you're a reporter, and you have everything to do with design, and the designers have everything to do with the reporting when we're doing the best job collaborating. So we really appreciate the preparation this team put together. I'll be following up with the recording and all the attachments and the everything that I promised that goes with it. And with that, I'll say goodbye, and thanks for the dedication of this hour. I think it was really well worth it. Take care, everybody.
Thanks, everybody, for coming.